Parliament often fails to live up to its critical task of holding the executive to account, despite its strategic vision to be responsive to the needs of the people. During its 2021 medium-term budget policy statement, the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana warned that rampant corruption was a persistent issue that's draining public finances. Let's talk about this then with political analysts Prof Dirk Kotze and Dr Ntsikelelo Breakfast. My thanks to you both, gentlemen. Welcome to the program. I referenced their comments by the Finance Minister a few weeks ago. Yesterday, in her briefing, the Auditor General once again reminded Parliament and stressed the importance of Parliament holding SOEs and departments to account. Professor Dirk Kotze, why is this not happening enough?
Well, I think it does happen a lot. The question is to what extent it can be enforced, to what extent Parliament has teeth. No, the Parliament sits most of the year nowadays. In earlier years, they sat only 6 months of the year. So Parliament is very active. The point is to what extent the persons who appear before them, whether it is at SCOPA, the Select Committee on Public Accounts, or the Portfolio Committees or other committees, to what extent the information that's presented to them or the information that's withheld from them, to what extent can they act on it? To what extent is there therefore enforceable powers for Parliament? And I think that's the main problem, is that they don't have that. But the accountability aspect of the role that it plays is to expose, to force them to expose also, because they can subpoena persons to come to Parliament to testify at any of the committees. For ministers to answer questions, yesterday the Deputy President had to answer questions. We know what happened with President Ramaphosa when he had to answer questions about his campaign funding. So, though it seems as if it is not that there's action afterwards, that there's some immediate steps taken, it is followed up by you and the media and others, and it becomes public knowledge. And that is, I think, what the element of accountability is ultimately. And we are just at an election, and the election is based very often on the outcome of these processes. So we don't see the results necessarily immediately, but Parliament can play ultimately a very important role in opening up, in enforcing accountability, in making it uncomfortable for executive members.
And I want to take that point and put to Dr. Breakfast what Professor Kotze is talking about is enforcing the accountability mechanisms in Parliament. Recently, I think it was about a month ago, SCOPA, the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, was quite upset because Eskom could not explain irregular expenditure, adherence to due process and consequence management. Is it that the rules themselves are not strong enough, or the people who are supposed to enforce the rules on accountability aren't all that familiar with the scope within which they have to play?
Yeah, I think, starting democracy is easier than keeping it. Starting democracy is easier than consolidating it, because consolidation of democracy is a process as opposed to an event. No wonder we've been having these ups and downs. But I think also opposition parties have a role to play in terms of holding the executive institution accountable. A case in point is what had happened, I can't remember when it was, I think it must have been in 2016, when the EFF, alongside the DA, laid a complaint to the Constitutional Court and argued that the legislative institution failed to hold the executive institution accountable. And the ruling was very much impressive, because the ruling was that the legislative institution had failed to hold the executive institution accountable. And because of that, there was that famous ruling that former President Zuma broke his oath of office. So I think the executive institution or other political parties can follow suit in that regard.
Do you think then, Dr. Breakfast, that parliamentarians have learned the lessons from the previous court cases where they essentially had to have the judiciary give them direction and hold them to account?
Partly yes and partly no. You must remember at the moment the ANC is in majority, and almost all the ministers who are part of the cabinet, part of the executive institution, are ANC members, and also other members who are outside the executive institution, who are part of the legislative institution, are by and large ANC members. So I get the sense that maybe there's a fear that if they go on the offensive and they become too hard on senior members of the party, they might be reprimanded in private if they become critical of them in public.
And Dr. Kotze, the issue of not acting or acting too late against issues has also been brought up recently when we talk about the presidency. Just yesterday, in fact, there was a conversation in Parliament where there was unhappiness with the SCOPA, once again, the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, unhappy with the presidency's reporting and feedback around certain SIU matters where the president was supposed to bring forth new responses. We saw another pause between the time when the president got the report on digital vibes and when some form of action was announced. How do we root that out?
Well, that's not so easy, because ultimately, and Parliament is the one who must act on its own powers, must use its own powers. And I think one has to keep in mind the principle of the separation of powers. The powers of the legislature of Parliament is primarily legislative powers, and of the executive, obviously executive powers. And the idea is that the two should not start to overlap. There is the element of accountability of the executive towards the legislature. The legislature has also some elements of accountability towards the judiciary, for example, when it comes about review of legislation and other matters. So one has to be careful that there is not an encroachment from the one side on the other. And what you've referred to in the previous question, I think, is an interesting one, because courts were actually being accused that they encroached on the role of the legislature by issuing judgments about accountability. Courts can, to a large extent, do review of the work and what happens within the legislature, but they cannot supplant, they cannot become an alternative for the role that the opposition must play in Parliament. So I think that we must keep clear. What is ultimately the main sword that parliamentarians have, and especially the opposition, is that first of all, Parliament must approve the budget. That is one of the key elements, and if they are not anymore satisfied with the work of the executive, then strictly speaking, in theory, in terms of constitutional theory at least, they can refuse the budget. Secondly, and we've seen some elements of it, is that they can censure the executive, for example, in the form of a motion of no confidence, and when it is about transgressions, also impeachment. So that is the sort of the fear that the executive can have if they don't act in accordance with what the legislature, Parliament expects of them. Now, the complication, obviously, in our situation and many other parliaments is that they are composed of parties, and the majority party is the government, which can constitute the executive. So it's not so easy for members of the ruling party to be independent-minded, that they can act as persons that enforce accountability.
So in essence, majoritarianism is not necessarily the most democratic way of dealing with issues. Am I right?
I would rather say it's not majoritarianism. It's rather the idea of parliamentarianism, which we have, where the majority of members of the cabinet, except for two, are also members of parliament. So there's an overlap between the legislature and the executive. And at the same time, the president is elected by Parliament in our dispensation, which means that Parliament can also adopt a motion of no confidence in the president, which is very unusual if you look at it all over the world. But at the same time, it means that the president and the leaders of the majority party, governing party, is also in control of the parliamentary caucus. And I think this is the complication that we still have to work with.
Okay.
Compared to a presidential system where the executive is completely separate from Parliament.
So, Dr. Breakfast, then I'll let you have the final bite of this cherry. We're seeing a decline in ANC electoral support with each election. Do you think the closer the margins are, the more effective a Parliament we might see as far as accountability?
Not really. I'm not a big fan of coalition formations, if you are implying that. I prefer that, after the electoral outcomes, there should be an outright winner. I don't have a problem with a dominant party, so long as there are mechanisms in place to make sure that there is checks and balances, there is a separation of powers, and so on.
Dr. Ntsikelelo Breakfast, Professor Dirk Kotze, my thanks to you both tonight, gentlemen.